Hello, everybody, and welcome to PerfBits. I am Mark Tomlinson, the chief performacologist in the PerfBytes land, one of many chief performacologists, not the only one. But I'm coming to you from a beautiful Friday after 2 weeks of a lot of work. The bags under my eyes, working a lot. So I apologize for missing last week. I was not feeling well at all, but I'm good today. I want to share some learnings about tracing. Our friend Hendrik does the Is It Observable channel, which is really cool on observability. And I've been implementing the latest and greatest Dynatrace stuff for OpenTelemetry at work, and I'm learning some really interesting things. I wanted to give you a couple tips on what I'm learning. First, of course, I'd like to give a shout out to all of the sponsors. Thank you. Thank you for being sponsors. Thank you for supporting PerfBytes and everything we do here and there. Most recently, our friend Scott Moore is doing the Perf Tour, which means he gets into a truck with this amazing Wi-Fi thing. You see a video from last season I did. We went out to Valley Forge Park here, and he's, of course, got amazing signal strength. He's a totally mobile performance guru. Scott Moore Consulting, you can find him on Twitter @LoadTester, or go on YouTube and look for the Perf Tour. SMC Journal is the other thing he does. He's sponsoring PerfBits just to do some extra stuff with us because he's a really nice guy. So we'll do some blogs, we'll do some tweeting, we'll do some other stuff. So shout out. I should probably make a button with a little thing that pops up here that says, check out the Perf Tour. You should check out the Perf Tour. Of course, Tricentis, our friends at Tricentis for many years, things have changed a bit, but they're still a fantastic company around Flood.io and the Neotis tools, Neoload being the best one for load testing, of course. Check them out. And of course, they have some amazing announcements. There were 2 of them recently in the Neoload world, which are pretty cool. So if you're a Tricentis customer in functional testing, check out the Neoload stuff. And if you want to do things in the cloud, you have a couple of different options with the Flood at flood.io. So check out Neotis Tricentis Flood, which would be cool. Of course, there's Catchpoint APM and the web page test tools. There's some really cool stuff in terms of their APM solutions. I personally, we're a Dynatrace shop. We've had New Relic, we've had Datadog. I actually know a lot about these APM tools and the evolution over the years. And Catchpoint is not falling behind in any way, shape, or form. So check it out, particularly the web performance add-ins that they're doing for web page test, which is cool. We're going to do some stuff with Abstracta. Our good friend Ryan Folk and Ryan Folk Consult. If you need a smarty pants, a really smart person who knows a lot of things, and you might not need them full time. They're not a work-a-day kind of person, but you need some advice, you need consulting. Maybe you do need a team to really lead you into the 22nd century of performance. Check out Ryan Folk and Folk Consulting, which would be very cool. All of the linkage, all of the data is below in these things, so you can check all of that out. That would be great. Let's talk about tracing and triage, and here's the context for what I'm experiencing. Now, over the years, there have been many different tools that do tracing and triage. In fact, you could plug stuff into the old, I'm thinking of the original Topaz product. Topaz, Mercury Topaz was pretty cool. But there were all sorts of things in the very, very early, before New Relic, kind of the Performant was one that ended up at HP for diagnostics, the very early Dynatrace stuff when Dynatrace first did its bytecode instrumentation. But in the Microsoft world, there's a long, long history, 30 years worth of instrumentation frameworks, instrumenting for logging, because the primary thing we did back in the day was to log everything. So in your logs, you'll find fields for, let's say, reference ID, context ID, correlation ID, registration ID, request ID. There's all sorts of things. Hopefully they're not actually, primary keys or sensitive data in the database, but we have been logging things across the system for years and years and years and years. Let me show you what I mean if I successfully get over here into my little world, and I hope that's nice. So let's say you have sort of 3 main systems, and you're going to write logs across those three systems. Now let's say this is system A, system B, system C, 3 different apps, right? And maybe on the back end, there's a database. So there's a database of some kind. Traffic comes in, maybe traffic also goes over here and we kind of split stuff. Maybe there's some traffic that goes between A, B, and C, that kind of stuff. So we have this flow of traffic coming into the systems. And if there's a request ID for, you're going to make a request, that hits, let's say that's the first thing. We're going to give you a session ID is part of the infrastructure of the work, but we're going to say you've got request ID written in the logs on system A. And then you start making some secondary calls. Maybe there's a flow for 3 or 4 different services that are together. As we started breaking systems out, when we used to just have a monolithic system A, you start breaking things out into microservices, right? You're going to end up with, let's see over here, system B has something called a correlation ID. Okay, so in system B, it's like a request ID, but now it's a correlation ID, because I'll tell you in a minute how that works out. And then at some point, we ran out of resources for CPU, so we had to break out service C, which is some kind of account lookup thing, and that has a reference ID. Now, of course, none of this is, it's just, we did some work, we spit stuff out in the log, and if there's a chunk of logs, you know, there's a chunk of 10 messages in the logs, and they all have the same request ID. And then over in the next one, you have a whole bunch of stuff where you have another bunch of messages, and you'll see they all have the same correlation ID. So if you're in the Unix world, it's very easy to grep through the logs. Love my grep world. You can grep for stuff, hey, grep for this request ID, whatever. The parsing of doing that is actually famous for all that kind of stuff. It makes it very simple. Well, if you've got kind of a flow of stuff, what we started seeing is, hey, service A, could you pass that, your request ID, over to service B? And now I'll log request ID and the correlation ID in this other log. So now I've got correlation and request ID. So if I do a grep across all the logs, I can actually find the request ID across multiple logs. Well, do you see where I'm going with this? Like, let's now, if I take request ID, correlation ID, and request ID, now for microservice C, in order to tie those in, I need both the correlation ID and the request ID, just to make sure I can actually go across service, you know, here's B, here's A, B, C. This is a nightmare, right? And of course, you know, 10, 15 years ago, somebody said, you know, why don't we just build a system, the framework for instrumentation that does this? So if you're in the open telemetry world, or you're in this kind of stuff, if you're in, if you work for a place that has an amazing amount of money that they want to spend on Oracle or SQL Server, and they're not, you know, running, you know, 1,000 transactions per second through an OLTP database, you might actually log all of those requests and correlation IDs into the database. And now you do a select and go find all of your logs and everything that way. Take this same schema, take that everything that I've put right there. Imagine you're going to install now a Dynatrace, or a Catchpoint APM, or a Honeycomb, or full open telemetry. And there's frameworks that make the tracing, spanning, like if you haven't done your homework on what a tracer is, where do traces come from, what is a span, and where does that data live as it flows through the system, what's an entry point, what's a span propagation. These concepts are something that Henrik follows quite closely. But the idea is that if you have a legacy tracing system and everyone on your team knows how to triage through logs, or they know how to triage, they get them into Splunk and they write their queries through Splunk, they get into a database. I mean, I was troubleshooting recently and I saw one of my developers for triage, hey, give me all of the records associated with this request ID, and there's like maybe 12 different select statements. And of course, all of the data, it maybe hits 5 or 6 different databases, doesn't really join them together, just kind of goes and finds them all and pulls them together. Automating this log lookup stuff becomes so simple in the tracing world. And here's the thing, the learning from all of that, laying that out, you can see the complexity of it, like trying to log across all this stuff and then trace it all together, find the needle in the haystack is really a pain. So to be brutally honest, if you don't want to take your ops team and tell them you have to learn a whole new way. I'm going to remove request IDs and correlation IDs and whatever. You should remove them if they're a performance bottleneck because you're moving all these IDs around and tracing stuff. But look in your framework, like in Honeycomb and in OpenTelemetry, as well as in Dynatrace, there's some really good support for if there is already a tracing source, an endpoint, an entry point that's coming in. If there's spans already flying around, like a W3C, a tracing tag, the whole beauty of that is if there's already a trace ID in a request header, in a request body, somewhere riding along in the metadata of that request between services, just attach, create a child ID, a trace ID. Hey, for my work in here, let me go back over here. So you'll just ride along. So let's say you had an origin, there was no tracing ID coming in from the request, it's just a client. So the first place in service A is where we find traffic and we will begin a trace. So that we give birth to a new entry point calling service A. So that gives me a trace ID and a span ID. So now my span has started. When service A makes a call over to service B, it's going to say, well, here's my trait. I'm going to have the same span ID, and then as a child to that span, because the trace is going to span across these two services, it's going to say, for my work down in here, I'm going to do that correlation automatically. And then for over C, instead of having all three of these, it says, well, here's the same span ID, and I'll have a trace ID for my work down below in those pieces. And all of that trace data can be over here in an APM tool. Oh, my blue pen is dying. We're going to throw that away. Can be put over there in an APM tool, right? Or in a repository that you do. It could be a time series database, most likely a time series database of some kind. But you get the idea that having those requests in the logs stranded down in the file, having all of those tracing IDs in your actual database with data, boy, that's a pain. Don't do that. You may actually have to require your ops team to have logins to an online transaction database to go triage stuff. So if they're triaging stuff while there's, the application's flying at 700 miles an hour at 34,000 feet, and then, you've got a 99% write activity happening, and you do a read in the middle of that, whoa! If you want to punish your SAN and drive your database guys nuts, do it that way. That's a real performance nightmare. We're actually doing a bunch of optimizations at Freedom Pay. We have some of this older behavior in the smaller apps. We've moved them off. So it takes a long time because there's a lot of moving parts and a lot of legacy. But getting all of that tracing and logging information over into its own data store, and if you can actually pull these logs, put them in Splunk, you can do logging into Dynatrace, you can do them in the APM tool, or do them in a separate, totally separate database where you can query those logs and search those logs. It's a beautiful thing to do that. So the real lesson here for me, and the tip I'm giving you is, if you've trained your ops team to do triage based on these old IDs and these old traces and logs and things like that, and they're not even really tracing or spanning, you can't really tell them to stop doing it the old way. But as you add in the tools, a new APM framework, a tracing framework, or an OpenTelemetry, or an observability framework of some kind, tuning that framework so that it can use the existing IDs. You can actually, you really don't have to instrument by hand. You're not really writing it by hand. You can use these frameworks and plug them right in, and you'll pick up a bunch of stuff. Or use the APM tool itself will give you a lot of that stuff. So it's just kind of a history of looking at, wow, I've got a bunch of these IDs rolling around. And I remember doing a triage where you pull one ID and say, is this it? Well, it said reference ID. No, I need the other one. Oh, sorry, it's not called reference ID, it's called request ID. And then there's like request ID with a capital ID, and then one with a lowercase underscore ID. Okay, so it's a different request ID, but they're two different apps because there's two different teams at two different dates. And I mean, you're already confusing the heck out of your ops team just to run a bunch of services simultaneously in parallel. Try to make it easy. So as you journey from the chaos of our legacy in IT to using traceability and observability, keep in mind about how you're doing spans and stuff. So that's my tip. Don't upset the apple cart, but try to migrate things over to the new system. And as you're tracing and doing that, and check out Henrik's channel. Is it observable? There's tons of great information out there. I'm finding some. The Catchpoint stuff has a bunch of good stuff. Honeycomb has a bunch of really, really excellent, well-written articles. And the Dynatrace stuff works really, really well. Yeah, good luck as you're, and of course, performance-wise, I'm trying to find the bottleneck. So if you can do a performance context around a given trace, that's what I really like. That's the, help me find the needle in the haystack kind of thing. That's really, really cool. Thank you guys for joining me. Thanks for listening and watching PerfBits, the PerfBitsness of the PerfBytes of the world. Follow us at PerfBytes, or you can follow us on YouTube, Twitch. This whole thing is in all these other places. Yeah. Let's see. I don't know what else I got nothing else going on. I'll see you guys next week. Have a fantastic weekend if you're in the Northeast. Hopefully the snow goes away, but it gets really nice out. And thanks very much for watching. I'll see you guys next time.